Good day, everyone. It's good to be back again. I know I haven't been online for a while, but now I'm back. And today I'll be discussing about a very interesting topic. For those who are new, I usually talk about geopolitics, international politics, international relations. And today I'll be looking at the United States African Summit, which happened in Washington and New York and in these capitals in America. It was a joint meeting between heads of state from Africa, who are, and it was organized by the United States of America. The aim of this meeting was to foster relationship, investment, political, social, cultural relationship between Africa and America, especially in a time where America faces great power competition in the African continent against Russia and China. This meeting comes at the backdrop of another meeting that was held in 2014 by the then President Obama, which was the first of its kind between America and the African continent. It is very interesting for me. One thing I noticed about this meeting is because the last meeting was in 2014. This meeting came in 2022. So when you can notice that there's a very big gap in terms of trying to engage African countries. The aim of the US in this meeting is to try and show that it cares about Africa, and its strategy towards Africa is different now. Before, the US was seen as as an authoritarian moral compass in terms of dictating to African countries about democracy, about how they should govern, trying to push African countries to make certain decisions, and it wasn't received very well in the African continent, because when the American companies and institutions wanted to invest in Africa, they required African countries to follow or to agree to certain concession, to liberalize their market, to accept democracy, and this has been has not been taken well by African leaders, because African leaders feel they're being treated as kids. And this has always been the relationship between America and Africa. It's always a master-servant relationship. The relationship has never felt like they're equals, they're business partners. But when China came to Africa 30 years ago, because China started courting Africa in the 1970s, 1980s, but China started heavily invested in Africa in the late 1990s. And when China came to Africa, it approached Africa as an equal entity in terms of even how discussions were held, how investments were done. The Chinese never questioned the culture or the political system of African countries. They just wanted to do business. And this was very attractive to African leaders, and that's why you see that China has really dominated the African continent. As we speak today, trade between Africa and China is $260 plus billion a year, and the Chinese have invested almost $1 trillion in the African continent. Vis-a-vis that, if you see the trade between America and Africa is $50 billion a year, and this wasn't the case when you look at 20 years ago. And you start to realize that the USA Africa Summit, for me, I can say it's a failure summit. It's passed by time because it's done out of a knee-jerk reaction. The intent wasn't to engage Africa. The intent of this meeting is to counter China. So that means the purpose of the meeting is already lost. As we speak now, Chinese has been having this meeting between Africa and China since year 2000. So if you look at this is the second meeting between America and Africa, you can see there's two contrast aspects here. And when you see how the Chinese handle their meetings are very, very, very meticulous. And you can see that even when the meeting is planned, the Chinese lay all the facts. They engage the countries, they engage the leaders, for months, the agendas that will be spoken, the investments that will be done. But when I look at the US African Summit, it was done hurriedly, no agendas were set. The meeting was supposed to be done in October, and then it was shifted again to November, because now the US was, when they had that the Chinese were taking over the Solomon Island, they pushed the meeting to November and brought the Pacific Island meeting, and this already shows that Africa has never been a subject in the American politics. And when Blinken was doing his tour of Africa, because Blinken was in Africa a few months ago, and even when you see why Blinken came to Africa, he came to Africa because Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was in Africa. Lavrov went to Ethiopia, Egypt, and Uganda. And then when Blinken heard this, he also started his tour. And he talked about how, this time they are not going to dictate to Africa. They're going to let Africa make its own decision, forge its own path. There was this whole talk about, let Africa decide its future. But the relationship between America and Africa is a very suspicious relationship. Even as we speak, even though the African leaders were called to America for the meeting, there's still suspicion. They don't trust America, because America still operates on a master-servant kind of relationship. As we speak now, there's a bill in the Senate to, it's to counter Russian malign acts. The bill proposes that African countries can be sanctioned if they engage with Russia, to counter Russian influence in Africa. And yet there is a meeting here in Washington, US-Africa relationship, trying to promote a relationship. So how can you promote a relationship when there's already a bill in parliament to sanction? African countries now are seeking self-determination and sovereignty. And they don't want to be picked and tossed around through this great power competition between Russia, China, and America. And that's why you see that most African countries are abstaining and not getting involved in this great power competition, because African countries understand that in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they really suffered a lot by picking sides, and they feel like they should not get involved. There are better issues in the African continent. There's a lot of problem in terms of education, healthcare, economics. They feel that these are the core things they should be thinking about, rather than just great power competition and competing amongst all these countries. And when I was looking at even how the meeting went, there was not that facade, there was not grandeur. I saw a journalist asking one of the press conference in America that each president coming to America is spending almost like $5 million, $10 million trip. Why couldn't the meeting be done on Zoom? Because most of these countries are poor, and yet they're even spending more money to go to America to have a meeting, which even the president of America won't have a sit down with each and every president. And that's why I'm trying to tell you that there's a difference between how Chinese do things and the Americans. Because even Joe Biden won't have like even a 5 or 10, 15 minutes sit down. It's just like, let's meet, let's talk. If you look at the Chinese meetings, how they handle, Xi Jinping or the president of China literally sits down with every president, like every president. And if you see even the pictures, the president of another country is there, the president of China is there, and there's that engagement. So that even you as a president, if you go to China, you feel like this meeting was successful, it was fruitful, and everything went according to plan. So I'm trying to see, and I feel like America is still suffering from the Cold War hangover, of always thinking that, it doesn't need the other people in the world, it's sufficient. Probably, sometimes, I can't blame him for thinking like that, because America dominated the world a few years ago. But they need to come and understand that the world is very different. Africa is thinking very different, and the politics of Africa are very different. For me, I don't think this meeting will yield any concrete results, and I don't expect any result, because let's not forget that China has 20 years experience in Africa, in funding projects in Africa, you know, and it's still funding projects. This is the first time America is trying. It's also, America is also trying to bring like its Belt and Road movement. Remember, Biden and the Europeans are planning bring back better world. It's like it's to counter Chinese Belt and Road infrastructure. But the Chinese have had vast experience. They know the continent very well. You know, the African people love the Chinese. The African people are not dumb. They know that also the Chinese have interest. But how the Chinese have presented themselves, it's, even if someone has interest, it's a business because they invest in to make money. They still that respect, and the respect is a big issue, because I feel that the Americans or the Western side is still having this master servant relationship, connotation with also a bit of racism, and they have never viewed Africa as an equal partner. They have just viewed Africa as a means to an end. And I don't know, I think that America should take advantage and try and align itself, because because I believe that even though China is very influential in Africa, most people still see America in a very positive aspect. So but considering this meeting, I'm not very optimistic, but we'll wait and see about the result. I'll keep you guys updated, and if anything comes up. Thanks again for always tuning in. Please like, subscribe, and share. And cheers. Ciao.